I grew up in Glasgow in a housing scheme or estate, as it's called in England, called Pollock, which frequently found itself at the top and bottom of all the wrong league tables. Crime, poverty, deprivation. Glasgow in the 80s was in the grip of deindustrialisation. So Glasgow previously had been the kind of industrial juggernaut of the United Kingdom. Our shipyards, our forges had shipped products and things of that nature all around the world. So in Glasgow, it was kind of understood that young people of a certain age, when they left school, they could go straight into a job working on the Clyde. And then these industries over the course of a couple of decades were wound down or closed entirely. And so this led to vast swathes of the population effectively becoming kind of idle economically. So massive rise in people being dependent on benefits, massive rise in poverty, and a general kind of malaise setting in where people begin to feel skeptical of authority. They begin to live in conditions of chronic stress due to the various forms of insecurity. Violence rises, family dysfunction rises, and then heroin hits. So Glasgow becomes the kind of epicenter of the heroin epidemic in the early 90s. Ultimately, that was when I would have been about 5 or 6. So I was feeling the effects of that at home, because my mother was an alcoholic and a drug user. My mother's name was Sandra. She grew up in Castlemilk, which was one of 4 housing schemes that were created in the late 50s. And they were created with a kind of utopian idealism. This was the post-war consensus when the main political parties all agreed that despite their differences, we had to commit to building social housing, we had to commit to full employment, we had to use the state to try and lift people up out of poverty. And these housing estates or schemes, they were very well equipped in the beginning. So this would have been the first time that people had a home with multiple rooms, a toilet, a bath, things of that nature that we take for granted now. But over the course of deindustrialisation, which occurred from the kind of 60s on to the 90s gradually, then you had these vast populations with increasingly less opportunity. And so by the time I came along in the 80s, my mother had already grown up in a dysfunctional home, and she bore the emotional, psychological scars of that. So I think having a child young, that creates a lot of stress. If you've not been given the tools to manage your own emotional life, what happens when you become responsible for someone else? And many people in those days, they did what worked for them to cope in the short term. And for my mother, that was alcohol. But over time, that gets out of control. So anyone who lives in an alcoholic home will know that you grow up with a sense of dread or fear or anxiety, because you never know what version of the person you're getting on any given day. And having recovered from alcoholism myself, I understand this even more now. When you're in the grip of it, you don't really realise or appreciate the harms it's causing other people, because you're very much consumed by this demon that only really cares about obtaining and taking whatever the substance is, alcohol, drugs, whatever. And as you begin to burn through your resources and burn all the bridges with family and friends, you feel compelled to turn to more extreme means of dishonesty, and other behaviours really that sort of lower your social standing and reputation, and really just are a bit of a nightmare to be around. So again, I see it from both sides. But she was a good person. Most alcoholics are, and the ones who recover, they clean up the wreckage that their addiction left in their wake. But unfortunately, for some people, rock bottom is death, and that was definitely the case with my old dear. My dad worked up until my mother left, And then when she left, there were 3 children to take care of. So working a full-time job and caring for 3 children who all have various levels of trauma or, whatever, it's very challenging. And you'll have a lot of people maybe watching who think it would be a doddle, but I don't think they truly understand what it's like. So he stayed home and, had to do the kind of laborious domestic daily stuff that parents have to do. And as a parent now, I can say it's torturous, and I'm married and I have only 2 kids and a wife. So I have more respect for my dad now than ever. He was a musical guy. He was in bands. He was a songwriter. But then when we came along, that all kind of took a back seat. But he carried that creativity into his style of parenting. So we were always encouraged to be creative, to express ourselves, not to settle for the first low-paid job that comes along, which is quite an unusual stance for a parent to take in a working class community where the real aim is just to get out of education and get a job. So I left home very young. I was 17. And after a kind of failed attempt to move in with a then girlfriend, then I was referred by a psychologist to a supported accommodation project, which was for homeless and estranged young people. And really the idea here was that this was a fully staffed project where you get your own accommodation, which you are responsible for, and the staff work with you to support you to gain the skills so that you can learn how to be independent, which often is what a lot of young people who become homeless lack, because the circumstances of them leaving home were so abrupt that they hadn't yet acquired the skills necessary to survive. So basic little things like paying your bills or cooking, or even just making sure that you don't stay home too much and become lonely. The staff are there to sort of help you with those things, and also there is mental health support provided. This was a time where if you needed help, you got it pretty quickly. It's nothing like now. Today, it's unrecognisable how long people have to wait for professional help or support when they're in genuine crisis. And often the lack of support is what induces the crisis in the first place. But back then, I didn't realise how lucky I was. But I took up drinking in that period. I remember the day that I bought alcohol, even though I couldn't afford it. And I bought it just to have it in the house. I didn't drink it. But I remember standing, very clearly I remember it. And I remember in that moment thinking, I will remember this moment. So there was some kind of foresight. I could see I was already in trouble. And I just bought this bottle of cider just to have it in the house. It was like a companion. And that was the role that alcohol played for me in the beginning. And it wasn't for years until I became alcoholic, but the dependency was growing, and it grew in isolation, social isolation, and grief. It's really hard to say what drives someone into addiction. Obviously, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that social deprivation and trauma and all of the things that come with it can be a predictor for it. But this doesn't explain how people from more affluent backgrounds develop addictions. So whatever it is, whether it's a personality that's more sensitive than the average person and so requires some kind of anesthetic to turn that all down, or whether it's just a habit that develops over time until you cross like some kind of threshold physiologically where you can no longer control how much you take, something switches. And what happens is you begin to experience a preoccupation with alcohol. And then when you take alcohol, you experience a loss of control or a loss of awareness or insight into how it's affecting you. So very early on, because I was young, I didn't have a lot of responsibilities. And like many teenagers or people in their early 20s, very egocentric, very self-centered. And so I didn't really see that there were any major costs to binging for days on end, getting high. But I began to experience after the parties, when I was back on my own again, quite debilitating side effects that at the time I didn't associate with alcohol. I thought I had a mental health problem that was clinical in nature. And so I went to pursue a diagnosis of, whatever. Back then it was bipolar disorder was the thing that doctors would speculate that you had, or it was anxiety and depression. Today it would be things like personality disorders or neuro divergence, and different phases that are different in vogue conditions that seem to be thrust upon you and don't always apply. And that was one of those. The last thing any doctor thought to ask me was, are you drinking a lot? Are you taking drugs a lot? Because a lot of the experiences I was having, hallucinations, hearing voices, sleep paralysis, these are all withdrawal symptoms from alcohol. And while they weren't severe enough for me to have the kind of shakes like the classic alcoholic does, or weren't bad enough for me to have to drink in the morning just to function, alcohol took control of me very firmly in my kind of mid-20s. And rather than confront the alcohol as the main driver of the issue, I confronted every other peripheral problem around it, because deep down I didn't want to accept I was an alcoholic. I couldn't imagine my life without alcohol. So that's the trick alcohol plays on an alcoholic mind. It wants to hide in the corner like a monster in a dark room. Anytime a light is shone on it, it will move to the other dark corner and it will present a mirage that points to any other reason for your condition other than the drinking, because it's like a parasite that lives in you. It hijacks your consciousness. It hijacks your awareness. And that's why the only thing that will stop an alcoholic from drinking is their own desire to stop. And even then, it's still a battle after that. One of the things that really got me through my difficulties in my 20s, but also acted as an accelerant to those difficulties, was the fact that I got involved in a local hip hop community. So I began performing under the name Loki and releasing music that drew on my experiences of growing up in Pollock and the dysfunction, and later on my kind of mental and emotional health. This created a guardrail where I didn't become too isolated. I was still getting vital social connection, forming social bonds, all the things that human beings need to thrive. And this was offsetting or mitigating some of the negative effects of alcohol. Increasingly, what I found was that there were nastier elements to my personality, which were part of my ego's defense mechanism. I didn't trust people. So I had this technique of almost being deliberately unlikable so that I didn't have to deal with social rejection. All of my best friends now, they'll each be able to tell you an experience in the very early days of a relationship where subconsciously I was testing their loyalty by being very challenging, getting in fights, saying kind of mean things. That was the weapon that I chose to protect myself within these communities. The only thing a tough guy's scared of is getting ripped verbally in front of other people, and I understood that really, really early on, that was even more of a serious weapon, than violence sometimes. But I deployed that thoughtlessly, and so a lot of people got caught in the crossfire. Then you add alcohol into the mix, and the fact that rapping almost gives you a license to be aggressive and kind of toxic, as people would say now. And before you know it, I'm really leaning into this persona that I've created, which bears no resemblance to the Darren who left Pollock, who wanted to be an actor, who was into theatre, was interested in being a playwright. And, there were no opportunities for people like me, though, to do those things. Rap was the only art form that you were allowed to do, really. What rap offered me was the the ability to veil my interest in music and writing and art behind a kind of masculine persona, because these were the things that you had to do coming from my background. You couldn't be into art. Any interest in anything out with the usual, the usual sort of co-signed interests, and you were kind of marked out as someone to be picked on or bullied or mocked, and usually by people who were just living in fear all the time. Fear of judgment, fear of ridicule, but they all clumped up together in little groups or gangs and gave the impression they were tough. And this really impacted how I then went on to express myself later in the hip hop scene. So it's interesting because I spent many years creating a persona that wasn't really a reflection of who I am, and then many, many years slowly deconstructing that until now, where I'm sort of closer to the realm of authenticity perhaps than I've been.
Hi, and welcome to Deep.
We love making videos, meeting people and letting them tell their stories.
We really hope you're enjoying the channel, and if you are and would like a bit more,
We've just launched the series as a podcast on Spotify.
It's the full interviews uncut, so you can hear the whole thing wherever you are, at home or on the go.
But no matter where you're watching the content, please remember to like, comment and subscribe, as it really helps the channel.
And don't forget to drop a comment below and tell us who you'd like us to talk to next.
Thank you. Now, back to our story.
Okay, cool.
There's a symbiosis between the stereotypes of middle class people and working class people, in the sense that a lot of it is based on a caricature of how the other person thinks and feels and lives. Now, not all stereotypes are completely baseless. Some of them, there is a kernel of truth. You have a lot of middle class people who have strong opinions and confidently assert those opinions, because that's the culture they've been raised in, where they're told that they are the smart people. They are the people who go on to administer society and culture and the arts. And working class people, they sense that, because the culture that they see, all they see is the middle class perspective, the middle class voice. And I'm not saying all middle class people think the same way or speak the same way, but there is a sensibility with each social class that's pervasive among that class and is very hard to deviate from. And the middle class sensibility sees working class culture as an absence of culture. So it sees working class culture as a kind of, as something that has to be redeemed by becoming more middle class. So this is where you're taught to speak properly. This is where your passion is confused with aggression. This is where your common language and parlance is seen as vulgar, or the subjects or tone that you take when you delve into certain subjects as an artist are seen as a reflection of your character or your personality rather than a reflection of your interests. So a rapper from a working class background who raps about guns and violence and police brutality, they're seen as violent. A playwright who writes about those things is seen as insightful, is seen as capable of handling lofty subject matter and theme and character. But any rapper who talks about an abusive relationship is assumed to have engaged in abuse, whereas the middle class people, whether they've experienced these things or not, they get free rein to tackle any subject they want without that being seen as a reflection of their experience or their nature. What that tells us from working class communities is that there's a very narrow range of arts and very narrow range of subjects that we can tackle without being excluded by middle class gatekeepers. So part of my work as an artist is about, reminding middle class artists that, in working class communities, we have our philosophers, we have our storytellers, we have our intellectuals. Just because they sound different when they speak or they look at things from a different vantage point, this doesn't mean that we're inferior to you. It doesn't mean that you're smarter than us. And there is much for you to learn if you come and walk alongside us instead of parachuting into our communities and lecturing us about how everything we do is offensive or abusive. I began to reach out for help in my kind of late 20s, so 26, 27. And I did that through local mutual aid groups. You'll hear about them, 12-step fellowships, Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. I realised that actually the only way I was going to get well and sober was by following the example of other people who had recovered from the same type of alcoholism that I have. There is a certain kind of wisdom that someone possesses when they've found a solution to a problem as grave as alcoholism. And it took me a while to accept that, because I too had been conditioned to think that professionals had all the answers. And they have many answers, but not all of them. And so I began going to meetings, and this was the first time that I had been confronted by people who used to drink a lot and then didn't. And not only didn't, but seemed happier not drinking. And that's powerful. That's one of the main ingredients of how you get sober. You need a tangible example to follow, because anyone in theory can say, just stop. But if you can't talk to someone about the specifics, what do you do on a Friday night when for years your mind and body's been conditioned to go into this ritual of going to the pub and getting a bag of whatever and being out for 3 days on the trot? How do you rebuild your life in the absence of that? But like many people, I was in and out and in and out. The idea of having a drink would return. I would think I'll just do it tonight or for the weekend, and then I would be gone again for months on end. So that process reinforced for me how serious the problem was, because when you have a period of sobriety and you think you've cracked it, and then you find yourself back in that dark room with other alcoholics, all trying to figure out how to get the money together to keep the party going. It's a humbling experience. It was because of that willingness to keep returning to those groups and those meetings and having the message reinforced again and again and learning from my mistakes that, for more or less the last 10 years, I've been alcohol and drug free. I've had some slips here and there. I was in rehab for a month a few years back after the success of my first book. But that's a miracle for someone who drank like I drank. What I found with the rap persona, which is a reflection of me, but I would say an emotionally stunted, younger version of me, quicker to rise to conflict, someone who's more willing to deploy aggression to get their way, kind of toxic behaviours. But toxic behaviours must be seen in context for young men. These behaviours are how we survive in the communities that we grow up in. In order to ward off conflict, you have to make people believe that you aren't frightened of it. And that's how the inauthenticity creeps in, because ultimately what you're trying to persuade everyone of is that you're not scared. But everyone's scared. Anyone who carries a knife is scared. Anyone who carries a gun is scared. And so that's how the persona develops. And with rap, you have an artistic license to embellish that. Loki was a kind of sandbox that I could play in, where I could act out this fantasy of being dominant, of being strong, of being feared. Of course, I'm 40 years old now. And while obviously I keep that toolbox there just in case, I don't want to set bad examples to my own children. And I want to live a peaceful life and an authentic life. And so the last kind of year for me musically has just been about setting that persona aside, even with my last album, not funded by Creative Scotland, which is all about the arts and all about the accent and all about the things that we have discussed. That album is me saying goodbye to Loki and me saying thanks to the hip hop scene for tolerating Loki for 20 years. But it's also symbolic of me in a new phase of my recovery where I recognise I may not be bothered by the obsession to use alcohol and drugs, but there are still other things I have to work on and be willing to let go of. And part of that is that tendency towards those more toxic masculine traits. The idea for the book came about because an author, pretty famous, respected author actually, Denise Miner, she suggested to me to write a book, which was the first time anyone had ever floated the idea. And it was based on the fact, in the run up to the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, I had just got sober. I had a lot of energy and I had a lot of time on my hands because I was no longer drinking every day. And this manifest as a real intense period of writing and opining and campaigning around politics and poverty. And so I was writing articles, which I didn't understand then, were cultural criticism or political commentary. But I knew that I wouldn't get a book deal because of my background and my reputation in the Scottish arts and culture as being someone who didn't play nice with the middle class gatekeepers. So I understood that memoir and personal lived experience was a way for me to create interest in a book from a working class person, and then I could smuggle in all of the political commentary and analysis that really I wanted to talk about. But I had no idea how big the book would become, and it wasn't written for a mass audience, it was written for local people. It's the culmination of everything that I understood about the world and myself at that point in my life. And that book has real legs in terms of where it's reached globally and how many people have been impacted by it. I mean, I still get messages about that book to this day. I still get royalty checks for that book to this day. And the second one, while I think it's a better book, people always say, yeah, I bought it, but I haven't finished it because it's too long. Taught me that the mind is a powerful thing. My mind truly told me a story that I could not enjoy life without alcohol or the promise of alcohol in the middle distance. Sometimes the best way to win is to admit you've lost, With me, alcohol was like a war. It was a battle I had lost many years ago, but I was still out every day fighting it, thinking this time it'll be different. And that actually accepting complete defeat and kind of a sort of powerlessness gave me access to power, And some people, they don't like that. They don't like that idea of describing themselves as alcoholic once they've stopped drinking. But I learned the mind is still so powerful that I can forget. That's what I'm dealing with. A feature of my condition is that I will always return to those factory settings unless I am actively engaged in recovery. If addiction's done one thing for me, it's humbled me, and that is, again, that's quite a task for someone with an ego like mine. If you're struggling with the question of whether or not you are an alcoholic or an addict, just know that people who aren't don't struggle with those questions. Very rarely does someone repeatedly return to that question and then find they don't have a problem. So if you're asking yourself that question, am I an alcoholic? The answer is probably yes. What you do with that information now is your choice. If you're supporting someone who has an addiction, understand that you play some kind of role in it. That's the nature of this condition. It's often a family condition, and we all adopt roles relative to the sufferer of the addiction. Sometimes we think we're loving someone by giving them things or money or excuses or protecting them from consequences. And sometimes that can help. But sometimes that can make things worse. Sometimes that's just a green light that we can continue to behave selfishly, addictively. For me, consequences are what brought me to my knees. Consequences dispensed with love, structured punishment. These things brought me to a state of reasonableness about what was going on. So counterintuitively, sometimes the best way to love someone with a serious addiction is to do it from a distance and stop engaging in the dysfunction by enabling it. But these are controversial things to say, obviously. We know what people need to thrive. We know that people need decent paying employment that's stable. They need secure, safe housing in communities that have access to well-kept, wide open spaces for exercise, social connection, and we need access to decent nutrition. Now, you go to any of the boroughs in London where poverty is high, and you tell me what you see. You don't see those things. But you can cross over the street, some places, and suddenly the house prices shoot up, and suddenly the pavements widen, and they're cleaner, and there's a park, and there's florists and groceries, and those people live 10 years longer than the people on the other side of the street. And we keep commissioning think tanks to figure out why this is, but we already know why this is. So when we talk about deprivation, what are people being deprived of? They're being deprived of those basic building blocks of health. And wherever we find poor health, we find cost, social cost, costs in welfare, costs in the NHS, costs in criminal justice, costs in the education system, which we are now in a kind of perma-crisis, trying to retrofit all of these social systems, trying to catch up with all the various trends that have been in motion for 20 years. And now we see a lot of the gains of the post-war period in life expectancy, interclass marriage, social mobility, flatlining or going in reverse. So these are very ominous warning signs in the cockpit of society. Their lights flashing red. Luckily for politicians now, they've got a prospect of a new phase of militarism and talk of war. And this will give all the working class people something to do in a few years. With the politicians, send them all in to fight. And the politicians get to take the performance-enhancing drug of war for their political failings. All over the Western world right now, very unimpressive, mediocre political leaders are enjoying higher polling ratings, higher popularity, telling a new story about society and a coherent vision, which has been sorely lacking for many decades. So don't think that all this talk of war is just because of geopolitics. There are many incentives. And I think actually a lot of us might be drawn into it because we're so sick of the negativity. We're so sick of the division. We're so sick of there being no answers. And the idea that it's all Russia's fault just so seductively simple. This is a difficult period coming up. Whatever it is, it's going to involve people en masse having to get out on the streets and do something, whether it's protesting a war or fighting a war. But I don't see any other way around it, particularly for working class people.